Greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, Robert Meyer Burnett. I invite you to watch and listen to the Designing Hollywood podcast, brought to you by Martika Ibarra and the great, legendary Hollywood costume designer, Marilyn Vance. I am afforded the wonderful opportunity of co-hosting the show. If you are interested in the magic of Hollywood, the design of Hollywood, the clothes of Hollywood, watch the Designing Hollywood podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts from, or find the video version on the John Campea YouTube channel. That's right, the Designing Hollywood podcast. Why would you ever want to miss it? Especially if you love the movies.
Robservations with Robert Meyer Burnett.
Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your master of fun and wonder, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your sommelier of sci-fi and cinema, your evangelist of the imagination, and of course, the still-to-be-defined existential Mr. Rogers. That's right, me, Robert Meyer Burnett, and I am Robcasting at you. You imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. This is Robservations episode number 886, which is amazing if you think about it. 886 episodes of this show, and that's just one show on this channel. My God, I hope you all just watch Que Pasa BGS with Alex and Roberto. They do such a great job, so thank you to them and their cool show. By the way, we were going to do a show tonight, but Lael was feeling out of sorts last night, and is not going to be available tonight, so I think we're going to push it till next week, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to do a show. Stay tuned. So a lot of people wrote me. They did. They wrote me yesterday. They're like, Rob, you're going to do a show for Star Trek's 57th anniversary. Are you not? September 8th being Star Trek's 50th anniversary. 57th anniversary. And, I figured I'd let it go. I figured I'm going to let Star Trek Day play out the way it should, let people enjoy Star Trek Day. Why should I come along and rain on the parade? Not that I'm going to rain on the parade, but maybe I will. You never know. But it's interesting because I've been thinking a lot about Star Trek, as I do. And, a lot of people are telling me that, as you know, I've expressed my discontent on the state of the franchise. Actually, since 2009, I've been expressing my discontent since 2009. It's now 2023. So, working on the better part of a decade and a half, being disillusioned with my favorite franchise. And, a lot of people say, well, Rob, it's just not for you anymore. Why do you watch it? Well, if someone says it's just not for me, the insinuation is it is for them. Or it's for someone else. And I have yet to find out who that is. Now, that's not to say that there isn't an audience for Star Trek, because there is an audience for Star Trek. And, for as many times as somebody's called me a gatekeeper, I don't consider myself a gatekeeper. I will never tell anybody what they should and shouldn't watch. As a matter of fact, I watch a lot of things that admittedly I will say, I enjoy this, but it's not, if you were to say, well, Rob, how can you enjoy this? I can say because I know it's not good, but it's still the spirit that it was intended to be taken in, I think is still there. Even if it might have, the final product didn't quite reach or exceed. You can have guilty pleasures. Everybody has them. We all understand why we have them. But nobody's going to hold up their guilty pleasure and try and pass it off as something other than it is. And I think everybody would know that. Now, I certainly wouldn't. I'm not interested in trying to convince people that something that I know is not as good. For instance, I know that right up there at the top of my list of great movies are things like The Godfather, All About Eve, which I think has one of the great screenplays of all time. I wouldn't. Casablanca is an incredible film. It still is, all these years later. I would not say that favorite things of mine, like, oh, I don't know, Night of the Comet, as much as I enjoy Night of the Comet for its own sake, I would not say it's comparable to those things. I know that. I understand that. And the interesting thing about the Star Trek franchise is we have an entire spectrum of greatness on one end and mediocrity to real just god-awfulness on the other end. And my beloved original series encompasses that. I would say 75% of the original series is good to great, and the other 25% is full of stuff that's not so good to great, including one of the worst episodes of television of any TV I've ever seen, which is And the Children Shall Eat. And I would never try and defend that as a great episode of television or Star Trek, or that it is misunderstood, or, you know, anything like that. You know, I wouldn't. But it really got me thinking as I yesterday, reflecting on the meaning of Star Trek Day. What is wrong with Star Trek? Why do I not, like, I always talk about the writing and the direction and the acting, even though I think the casts are pretty uniformly excellent. Like, what's the problem? What is the problem? Why have I not liked Star Trek for all this time? I mean, obviously, the people at Paramount, Star Trek is not a gigantic hit for Paramount. I don't care how you want to couch it. The stock price over there at CBS, Paramount, Viacom, it's in the toilet. It's not doing well. The Taylor Sheridan shows, you know, whether it's Lioness, whether it's Mayor of Kingstown, the Yellowstone saga, he's doing other shows. They're like in the Taylor Sheridan business, and on the other hand, they wanted to be in the Star Trek business as well. But Star Trek has not proven to be, it's still, as it always was, as Star Trek always was, it's niche. It doesn't appeal to everyone the way, say, a show like Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon do. Although I would maintain if Star Trek was made correctly, it might. And that really got me thinking. And I was thinking about, you know, how I felt about Star Trek, and I realized that for the most part, no one knows how to make Star Trek anymore. And I know you're thinking, wait, what? There's animated shows, there's all kinds of things. No one knows how to make Star Trek, I would say. Now, I wanted to read you something from Socratic.org. I wanted to define the difference between farce and satire. Farce is a comedy that relies on overly exaggerated, dramatic events. That is a farce. A satire is a comedy that heavily relies on insults and the ridiculing of people, groups, society, political groups, etc. The difference is that farce relies on what happens in the story and play, and satire pinpoints specific people to ridicule. Now, I would say that a show like, for instance, Star Trek Lower Decks is kind of both, which is sort of interesting because Mike McMahon, the creator of Lower Decks, made that Next Generation Season 8 like Twitter thread, and of course, I think that Twitter thread encompasses everything that I don't like about modern Star Trek because, as I've said before, but you know what, I'm going to get to this. I'll get to this. But what I wanted to talk about was my vehement hatred of modern Star Trek began in 2009 with J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movie. And in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movie, I thought it began promisingly enough, where the Kelvin encounters the Narada, and the Narada, even though the Captain Nero of the Narada is one of the dumbest characters, I mean, in terms of he's stupid. As a character, he's really stupid. And I've talked about that before. He's gone back in time, and rather than solve the problem that's made him mad, which he could do, he could go back in time and tell the Romulan homeworld there's going to be a supernova 100 years from now. We could save everybody because I'm really angry and all the people I've loved have died, so now I'm going to bring my vengeance down upon everybody I blame for it. But oh, no. Instead, he's traveled back in time, and he doesn't do that. So he's monumentally stupid, and I have no sympathy for the guy. He's an idiot. And I know you're not supposed to think about that, but he is. And I think that J.J. Abrams' big screen efforts suffer a lot from that idiocy. throughout his 5-film science fiction oeuvre, Star Trek Into Darkness, Super 8, The Force Awakens, and The Rise of Skywalker. How did he get to make all those movies? And why hasn't he made a movie since? There's a reason. But anyway, I'm sure he's a nice guy, though. So, that being said, the thing that really cemented it for me, there were 2 things in Star Trek 09 that I hated. Because to me, it showed a fundamental lack of understanding of what Star Trek is. And it wasn't because J.J. Abrams said in every interview he ever gave, I don't like Star Trek. Star Trek was always too philosophical for me. The first was the opening of the movie after the scene with the Kelvin, when we meet young James Kirk, who's stolen a car, a vintage car, a 300-year-old car. And while being chased by a police officer, obviously he's underage, he inexplicably drives it off a cliff into a quarry where apparently they've been mining raw materials to make starships or whatever. And I thought to myself, first of all, why would a kid do this? Why would young James T. Kirk, who was not described this way, if you listen to how Finnegan described him in Shore Leave, he was not that way, or he was not that way as Gary Mitchell described him. This was a punk kid who wrecked what would probably be a priceless artifact from the past. Kirk had always been somebody portrayed in the original series as somebody who appreciated antiquities and things like that. So I always hated that. I was like, what is this supposed to, how am I supposed to like this character? You know? Now I would juxtapose that with the opening of Collision Course, which is the last Star Trek novel that Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens collaborated with William Shatner on writing. That book opens with a scene with a teenage James T. Kirk who is on Tarsus 4, the colony that is overseen by Kodos the Executioner. For those of you who have not seen Conscience of the King, a first season original series episode, in that episode it recounts the history of what happened on this colony world, where there was an incredible famine, and the governor of the colony, Governor Kodos, decided the only way to save everyone was Thanos style to execute half the population, so there was enough food for the other half of the population to eat, which he ended up doing. In the beginning of this Star Trek novel, again, Judith and Garfield, Reeves-Stevens, Shatner comes up with the stories, the Reeves-Stevens would write the book. The young Kirk rescues children from execution, saves a group of children from execution as a teenager, showing leadership skills, showing courage under fire. All the things that you associate with James T. Kirk was beautifully established canonically in Star Trek canon, and this is the best way, where you've heard something mentioned, and then when you actually see it depicted, it pluses what you have even in your mind. Well, that's what, to me, great Star Trek really is, and that's why the Reeves-Stevens, who wrote, if you're interested, read their book Federation or read their book Prime Directive. It represents, I think, the pinnacle of Star Trek fiction. And to me, that's where you look for great Star Trek. But I realized, and maybe I don't know why, it never occurred to me, but no one since 2009 knows how to make good Star Trek. Now, they make entertaining Star Trek or whatever, but it certainly hasn't caught on in the zeitgeist. I mean, the people that are already predisposed to liking Star Trek watch it, but it certainly hasn't been a breakout ratings hit for Paramount, CBS, Viacom, whatever. It hasn't become a water cooler show, you know. But what I would say is that that's why in the 10 episodes we got of Strange New Worlds, we got an animated crossover episode and a musical. Things that, because I would say that the creators of these shows, especially Strange New Worlds, don't know how to make Star Trek. And there's a reason for that. And I have some articles, as I know you knew I would. But I would say that, so yesterday was Star Trek Day. And I would just like to say that here's Jerry O'Connell as the host. Now take a look at him. He's obviously having a good time. But Star Trek as game show, Star Trek as variety program. I mean, there was never a Star Trek holiday special not like there was for Star Wars, but these Star Trek Day experiences, and also I would say Will Wheaton's Ready Room shows come close. And it was also a celebration of the 50th anniversary of Star Trek animation. Now, one of the things that we were able to see, they now have short Star Treks. These aren't canon. So what they've done is they've taken the medium of animation, and they're celebrating 50 years of animation, because for those of you who don't know, the animated series, the original Star Trek animated series that had most of the cast come back to do voices, and Walter Koenig even wrote an episode. He wasn't in the voice cast, but he wrote an episode called The Infinite Vulcan. It won awards for children's programming. And it was a very serious attempt to continue on Star Trek. A lot of the same writers came back to write for it. Gene Roddenberry produced it. The voice cast was essentially the same. And in a half-hour format, they were able to create some very compelling Star Trek storytelling. You know, one of the classic episodes of Star Trek, Yesteryear, where Spock goes and visits his young self. He pretends he's his own cousin. And you see a pivotal moment in young Spock's life, which they echoed in Star Trek 09, but very, I think, badly, but okay. But it was a serious show. Now, on this short trek that they showed yesterday for Star Trek Day, it was a recreation of the Lou Scheimer version of Star Trek, the Filmation version of Star Trek. And they did a really great job duplicating the look of all the characters. Moress, the Cation. They did Spock, who looked like Leonard Nimoy, but was voiced by Ethan Peck. But in great Star Trek fashion, here is what Kirk looked like in the animated show. This great recreation of Star Trek, but Kirk was a goof. Kirk was a goof. And look, I understand that what they were trying to do, but that's not what, I mean, apparently this was Pete Holmes, you know, the Pete Holmes version of Kirk. And he was a stand-up comic, and he had the Pete Holmes show, and he's done, he had a show on HBO. So this was Pete Holmes doing James Kirk. And then, of course, also Chris, quote-unquote, Casper Kelly was involved. He was a co-creator of the Adult Swim series, Your Pretty Face is Going to Hell. So once again, the people that were behind this episode, and specifically behind Kirk, played it as a goof. And in this episode, we also had characters, bridge officers, that look like this and that look like this. Was this farce? Was this satire? Hey, you can watch this. I don't even think it's 10 minutes long, and you can watch it on YouTube. The thing is, what you had the original, here we are celebrating the original animated series, the award-winning animated series that, in a way, I mean, there were a lot of animated TV shows. There was a Planet of the Apes animated show. A lot of the most famous shows of the time ended up having animated counterparts, but Star Trek was head and shoulders above them because it was very serious. This, of course, I guess it's supposed to celebrate the 50 years of animated Star Trek, and it turns into a goof. And I get that people really like it. But I would maintain that the biggest problem Star Trek has is it is no longer serious, and no one takes it seriously. Even the people that are writing Strange New Worlds or Discovery are coming at it from a point of view that doesn't allow them to make great Star Trek, or Star Trek that will ever resonate beyond the week that it airs. Not like the original series did. And the question is it not made for me? And if it's made for other people, I would say that the other people that it's made for, fleetingly, is being made in the wrong way. Because what you want, Star Trek is a show that for decades inspired and engendered a fervor. Indeed, it created modern fandom. The first big media conventions, not literary conventions, but media conventions, really began in 1972 with the first Star Trek conventions. Now we, of course, have a yearly Vegas convention, but if you go to that yearly Vegas convention, it's not exactly a bastion of youthful energy, if you know what I'm saying. And why is that? Like, because you don't have young people that are inspired by Star Trek anymore. There's an audience that's already predisposed to liking it. Sure, you have new people, new stragglers come in for whatever reason, which is fine. But I would say that Star Trek is completely irrelevant to modern audiences. Doesn't mean people can't like it. Oh, I enjoyed this because it tickles your nostalgia bone or whatever. But it doesn't get inside you the way it used to. You know, I've often talked about these books, the Best of Trek books, from the magazine for Star Trek fans. These were literally books of essays that did deep dives into Star Trek topics, characters, situations, aliens, the way ships worked. You'd be surprised. I mean, these were pretty heady deep dives into Star Trek subject matter. You're not going to get people to write books like this today because, I mean, maybe you'll see an article here and there, especially when it comes down to personal identity and how someone's more represented now in certain areas of Star Trek than they ever have been before. But that's because Star Trek it wasn't about having people identify personally necessarily with the characters. Star Trek worked more on a broader canvas. It definitely did have that, certainly. I mean, the idea that there were Lieutenant Uhura was on the bridge, that was a huge deal. But here's the thing. They knew that putting Lieutenant Uhura on the bridge itself would make the statement. Or when they cast other black actors like William Marshall to play Dr. Richard Daystrom, or Percy Rodriguez to be the Commodore, the head of a starbase, who presided over the court-martial of James Kirk. They did those things because that's how they showed progression in the future. But they didn't have to make a big deal about it. They had to keep that under the radar. They just did it. They didn't need to be patted on the back for it. They just did it, and that was revolutionary. That was extraordinary at the time. But nobody had to make a big deal of it. But the people that it meant something to, they certainly knew what was going on. But anyway, these days, would anybody spend books or a magazine, a zine, writing essay after essay after essay after essay about various in-universe aspects of the story? They'll write plenty of essays about, let's talk about how Star Trek relates to me today and my group of whomever, which is fine. But again, that's about you. That's not about the in-universe Star Trek. And I don't think that anybody is capable of making in-universe Star Trek anymore. It's always past the fourth wall. Always. Whether it's Pike and his haircut, or cooking for people, to Spock having emotional outbursts and crying every episode and being treated like a teenage idiot, or falling in love with multiple women. You know, I mean, Spock's openly having affairs with people on the Enterprise, which is, to coin a phrase, illogical. But anyway, there's a couple articles that I wanted to read, as you know, and one is a very long article that is the kind of article that would have been in the Best of Trek. But I want to start out with this article. And this article is about the Kobayashi Maru and how Star Trek 09, well, you know what, I'm just going to read this article. It was in Medium. And it was published on September 16th, 2017. Great life lessons from the movies, Star Trek and the Kobayashi Maru no-win scenario. And it's by Brett Siegmiller. How many times have you given up on something saying, it's impossible, it can't be done? Well, every time I try and use the Force to pick an X-Wing up out of a swamp, I think that. Sometimes this is a verbal complaint to a willing ear, or it's a mental tirade that blocks any forward movement on our part. Either way, I would think that most people have fallen into this mental trap at one time or another. I know that I've been guilty of this mental state more times than I'd care to admit. The funny thing is that almost 100% of the time, the things that we think are impossible are in reality merely difficult. Our brain tries to tell us that the words impossible and difficult are one and the same thing, but of course our brain makes a living at trying to confuse us. Most of the time, we haven't actually really tried, or we haven't gone through the effort of trying to solve the problem in a unique way. I can't count on how many times I've said something is impossible only to find that someone else went out and accomplished the thing I said couldn't be done. It's embarrassing when you realize that the only reason why you didn't accomplish a particular task is merely because your mind told you you couldn't do it. In short, we accept no-win scenarios in our lives all the time. But the people who seem to succeed most in life are the ones who don't seem to believe in no-win scenarios at all. Now, I'd like to go back and say one of the most interesting elements in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, was the Kobayashi Maru test. The movie opens with it, and as Kirk says, it's a test of character. It's a test of character to see how you respond in it's a thought experiment, even though it's a cosplay thought experiment, but it's really interesting because you have to use what you've learned. You have to use your knowledge, presumably, of all different kinds of whether it's celestial navigation, whether it's armament, whether it's ship, the capabilities of your ship in terms of propulsion and how fast things can react. There's a lot of interesting things that we actually see in the beginning of Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan that inform the idea of what a no-win scenario is. But suffice to say, it does in fact seem rather sophisticated. And as Kirk says to Saavik, there's no way to win, it's a test of character. And the whole movie goes back to that idea, the Kobayashi Maru, the no-win scenario, the fact that McCoy says, you're looking at the only man who ever beat the no-win scenario. And of course, we learn in that movie, he cheated. Kirk cheated. He didn't believe in the no-win scenario, so he changed the conditions of the test, making it possible to win, to beat, and to rescue the Kobayashi Maru ship from the Klingons. Now, the thing is, I would offer that he received a commendation for original thinking because that was a way to win that no one had tried before. And the thing is, it wasn't necessarily cheating. It was using ingenuity in a three-dimensional way. I mean, you could say that, okay, he did change the conditions of the test, but he actually did something. He took initiative and was able to change something he didn't believe in that nobody caught, and he was able to get away with it. Now, he still had to play it out because presumably he had to make it look like he changed the conditions of the test and something altered, that he was still able to show his command prowess and rescue the ship. It wasn't an obviously broken simulation, at least we don't know, but that's not the way I read it. Anyway, back to this article. Which brings us to Star Trek and the infamous Kobayashi Maru test that was popularized in the Star Trek classic, The Wrath of Khan. In the Star Trek universe, the Kobayashi Maru is a test created by Starfleet that is designed to be unwinnable, thereby teaching cadets important leadership lessons in the face of certain failure. Of course, the idea behind this test is utter nonsense, but we'll get to that in a moment. The Kobayashi Maru test has become synonymous with no-win scenarios in popular culture. Even USA's TV show Suits had fun with the idea of the Kobayashi Maru in Episode 7, Play the Man. Harvey Specter, the firm, has presented an exercise where there's potential for failure, okay? All I'm saying is try to create a situation where there's not even a possibility, Kobayashi Maru. Mike Ross, Kobo what now? Harvey, Star Trek, Captain Kirk. He wins a no-win situation by rewriting the rules. Mike, so you're a Trekkie? Harvey, hey, Captain Kirk is the man. I don't want to hear another word about it. Now, enough about your fake law problem. Let's deal with my real one. Mike, aye, aye, Captain. While it is only explained in The Wrath of Khan how Kirk beat the unwinnable test, 2009 Star Trek actually shows Kirk beating the Kobayashi Maru and a subsequent confrontation with the test's programmer, Spock himself. By the way, that was not canonical. They made that up for the 2009 movie. Of course, cheating is cheating, but if you deliberately try and create a no-win scenario, then is it actually cheating to cheat? Think of the inanity of the Kobayashi Maru experience. Spock insists that the test is designed to force the testee to face a no-win situation with the intent of getting the individual to face fear and death. Okay, that's not what the Kobayashi Maru is. You can't face fear and death in something you know is a simulation. As he says in Star Trek, the purpose is to experience fear in the face of certain death, to accept that fear and maintain control of oneself and one's crew. This is the equality expected in every Starfleet captain. But can a simulation truly generate feelings of genuine mortal danger? I remember when I was a child having an argument with one of my older brothers because I insisted that video games had become so realistic that I felt I knew what a real war felt like. My brother, rightly so, told me how wrong I was because a video game, no matter how realistic, would never prepare you for the totality of a real, true-life experience. Simulations can't compare to the real world, and they can't replicate the results of the physical world. Spock's example is academia at its worst, trying to play a test off as something greater than it actually is. A test in school does not prepare one for life's intricacies. Only life experience, grit, and ingenuity can do that. School in all forms is great for what it is, but one must take what is learned in academics with a grain of salt and realize that theories are great in theory, but can't always necessarily be applied to the fast-moving pace and emotional complications of the physical world. One of the reasons why Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game is so timeless is because it portrays this idea to great effect. By the way, if you haven't read Ender's Game, this is a spoiler. Ender couldn't have done what needed to be done to win the Formic War had he known that his simulation was killing real soldiers with every action he took. To him, the game was a simulation, therefore it didn't matter if he sacrificed his entire armada to win the war. It wasn't until the truth was revealed to him that the gravity of what he had just accomplished came crashing down on him. He was responsible for the deaths of thousands, if not millions of lives on both the human and the Formic side. Had he known that he was sending actual human beings into battle, Ender would have made extremely difficult or different strategic decisions during the course of the war because he wouldn't have been so willing to make such blatant sacrifices as he did to ruthless effect. Clint Eastwood's movie Sully, based on the Miracle on the Hudson event, while not entirely historically accurate, plays into this idea as well. A large part of the film deals with the differences between real-life scenarios versus simulations. Just because a feat can be achieved in a simulation, does that mean that the same can be replicated in the real world? That is why Spock's pronouncement that the purpose of the Kobayashi Maru is to experience fear in the face of certain death, to accept that fear, is nonsense. Does anyone look afraid during the course of the Kobayashi Maru simulation? In both The Wrath of Khan and Star Trek, there is not a fearful face to be found. Everyone knows it's a simulation, therefore fear doesn't even register. It's not real, therefore it doesn't generate a real response. It's easy to act one way in a simulation, but it's an entirely different thing in a real-time event. You can play a horror-themed game and feel a sense of dread, but the type of fear that comes from mortal peril is a hard thing to pull off through a simulation. By Spock's own admission, then, the design of the Kobayashi Maru test is to generate emotion, not to get his students to find real solutions to actual problems. As portrayed in Star Trek, underneath this icy facade, Spock is an emotionally unstable individual. For someone who claims to deal exclusively in logic, he sure spends a lot of time talking and thinking about emotions, as does Ethan Peck's Spock in Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Strange New Worlds. They do not understand how to write Spock. They have not understood how to write Spock since 2009. They continue to not understand how to write Spock. Spock chose to pursue the Vulcan philosophy. He's not some half-formed student. He was raised by a loving, half-human mother. Spock knows more about humanity than probably humanity knows about itself. He doesn't have problems with humanity. What he has problems with is reconciling the fact he's chosen to live amongst emotional humans while also trying to pursue and have fealty to the Vulcan philosophy he has chosen to follow. And if you watch the original series and the way Leonard Nimoy plays Spock, it's fucking brilliant. Zachary Quinto is a good actor. And if you watch something like, Margin Call, which is a movie he helped produce, he's a great actor. But his portrayal of Spock, completely unhinged. He should be in the next cell next to Hannibal Lecter. But anyway, bringing up Kirk's father was a blatant attack on Kirk's emotions in an attempt to distract him from the illogical fallacy of the Kobayashi Maru. At the end of Ridley Scott's The Martian, Matt Damon's character Mark Watney is talking to a group of students and says, at some point, everything's going to go south on you. Everything's going to go south and you're going to say, this is it. This is how I end. Now you can either accept that or you can get to work. That's all it is. You just begin. You do the math. You solve one problem, and then you solve the next one, and then the next. And if you solve enough problems, you get to come home. That is the perfect example of a person putting aside their fear of failure and death and moving forward with solutions, not wallowing in an emotional pit. So we've established that the Kobayashi Maru is entirely anchored on emotion, not reason, intellect, or ingenuity. So why was Kirk's solution so genius? While we don't know the machinations of how Kirk went about reprogramming the test to make it winnable, it's not really important. The importance is Kirk's mindset. After failing twice at beating the test, Kirk knew that he had to do something different, something that had never been tried before to crack the glass ceiling. As Kirk says multiple times, I don't believe in no-win scenarios. How many times have you heard that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? I know I have, and it grates on me every time because it has become an overused cliche. This quote is often attributed to Albert Einstein, although the phrase actually first seemed to pop up in a Narcotics Anonymous pamphlet in 1981, which says insanity is repeating the same mistakes and expecting different results. Note the difference. Insanity is repeating the same mistakes, not necessarily repeating the same actions. Think of the athlete trying to perfect their sport. Think of the importance that repetition has during the training phase. However, there's good repetition and bad repetition. This is what coaches are for, to tell their athletes when we're repeating mistakes, not to tell them to stop practicing. This is what Kirk understood. Doing the same old thing would give him the same result. Repeating mistakes would inevitably lead to failure. To win, he would need to try something new. He had to alter the rules of the engagement, quite literally in this case, and it paid off in the end. Now, I would like to point out that in Star Trek 09, in a deleted scene that you can watch on the Blu-ray, Kirk actually seduced an Orion, a green-skinned, a hot green-skinned girl that he was either dating, but in it, he seduced her, and he got her. This isn't J.J. Abrams' movie that Bob Orsi and Alex Kurtzman wrote. He got her to change the test. He didn't. He seduced a woman and had her do it for him, which means that he put her Starfleet career in peril as much as he might have put his career in peril. Luckily, they cut that out in the movie, but the fact that they even had that scene in the script at all and shot it shows how fucking wrong those people were to be making Star Trek in the first place. Just a thought, and it probably wasn't them. I'm sure maybe a studio note said, you can't put this in the... It denigrates Kirk, it denigrates the girl. I mean, how horrible is that? Pretty fucking bad. But these are the kind of people that control Star Trek now, and have since 2009. His refusal to take the test at face value and go about finding a way to actually beat the test is in a way artistic. In Aaron Sorkin's Steve Jobs, when confronting John Scully at a dramatic board meeting, Jobs says, I sat in a garage with Wozniak and I invented the future because artists lead and hacks ask for a show of hands. I don't normally think of artists as leaders, but if that's true, then Kirk was an artist because he led where others followed. The problem with a no-win test is that if the testees lose, then you can say that they experienced an important life lesson. But if they do the impossible and find a way to win, then you can either criticize them for cheating or cheer them on for forward thinking, which is exactly what happened with Kirk in Wrath of Khan and in canonical Star Trek history. When confronted with a seemingly impossible mission or task, realize that the thing presented to you is probably not impossible, and it might just require a mindset change to think of the problem in a different light. When you start winning enough no-win scenarios, then you start to get to the point where you stop seeing those scenarios at all. While I'm not advocating for cheating, what I am saying is that our mindset matters. Spock himself concedes that Kirk was correct at the end of Star Trek when Kirk says to Leonard Nimoy's Spock Prime from the original timeline, you know, coming back in time, changing history, that's cheating. Spock Prime smiles and replies, a trick I learned from an old friend. In Wrath of Khan, Kirk says, I changed the conditions of the test. I got a commendation for original thinking. And then he says one of the manliest cinematic lines in history. I don't like to lose. I guess Kirk does run on emotions after all. And I think that the difference between the Kobayashi Maru scenario as talked about in Wrath of Khan and as played out in the film and as portrayed in Star Trek 09 is a great example of what's entirely wrong with modern Star Trek and the writing in modern Star Trek. It's just not good. Overall, all of it. You're either telling satiric, farcical stories, or you're telling facsimiles of what you believe Star Trek stories to be. And it's not necessarily the fault of the people that are writing Star Trek today. I would say that they don't have the educational background, the literary background to understand what Star Trek actually is supposed to be. Now, how can I sit here and say this? See, I don't have to say this. History already said it. History has already defined what Star Trek is. The original series, which was considered to be a failed show after 3 seasons, endured. It developed a fan base. Now, if you want to look at the differences between Star Trek, you know what we get today? We get Jerry O'Connell looking like this. And you know what? I should have pulled this up, but I didn't. What we get in the past, in the 1970s, was the fact that the very first space shuttle made by the United States of America, when it was rolled out, it was called the Enterprise, and they brought the cast to see the Enterprise rolled out. Now, cynics among us, and I'm one of those people too, I'm going to bring this up, that shuttlecraft was never slated to ever go into space. So Star Trek fans should have fought for the second space shuttle to be called Enterprise, which was the first space shuttle to go into space, because the Enterprise actually never went to space. It was a test shuttle. But hey, you know, that's am I splitting hairs? I don't know. See, maybe this is the problem with fandom in general. It was a great idea to go after the first space shuttle and want to name it Enterprise, but nobody stopped and thought, this space shuttle's never actually going to go into orbit, so perhaps we should wait for the second space shuttle. There's a lesson there. I mean, the first shuttle was named Enterprise. It just never went into space. So, there you go. Now, I have a much longer article to read, and this next article, I think is a very important article, and I was reminded of it because I'd read it when it first came out, and I was reminded of it today. And it is the concept of Kirk drift. Kirk drift is the perception of the character of James Tiberius Kirk that is actually inherent, or that is actually portrayed in Star Trek the original series and the classic Star Trek films with the original cast. Star Trek the Motion Picture, Star Trek 2, Star Trek 3, Star Trek 4, Star Trek 5, Star Trek 6. I think the drift had really started in Generations, but we'll give Generations a nod too. But this is an article, and I do so love this article. And it's a long one. And I will stop. You know, before I jump into it, let me see if anyone, I want to get to why are people saying, Irene says, happy birthday, Rob. Don Johnson saying, happy birthday, Rob. Wait a minute. Happy birthday, Rob, and we're here for it, sir. Okay, first of all, who's told you that it was my birthday? I don't know. And if you're sending me super chats because it's my birthday, please stop. You can send me super chats and ask questions. My birthday is May 15th. It always has been May 15th. Who said that it was my birthday today? Did somebody mistook something I said? It's not my birthday. My birthday is May 15th. And everybody was very generous on May 15th. I just want to make sure that people know that it's not my birthday. It was Star Trek's birthday yesterday. Star Trek turned 57 years old yesterday. So I just want everybody to know that. It's Star Trek's birthday. Happy birthday, Star Trek. I am not 57. So, Star Trek is. So anyway, so Tom Jr. Jackson says, on behalf of the chat, happy birthday, Rob. It's happy birthday, Star Trek. Word Balloon. John Suntress, if you haven't read or listened to the Word Balloon podcast, John Suntress out of Chicago. Hey, buddy, I got something cooking in Chicago. We have to talk. I'm going to come to Chicago in the next 2 months. Those cowards crap on Kirk in the new short, but don't have the balls to call him Kirk. The captain, my ass. Happy birthday, dude. Keep up the good fight. It's Star Trek's birthday. Chemist says, happy birthday, Rob. We're here for it, sir. Billy D. Shillams says, maybe Taylor Sheridan, he should do Star Trek. I'll tell you one thing, it'd be better. Don Johnson says, happy birthday, Rob. Irene Jobson says, happy birthday, Rob. Chemist goes on to say, Chemist says, Irene Jobson is gorgeous. You know what I got to say? Irene Jobson's kind of a looker. Not kind of, she is. I've seen her Instagram feed. She's very, very cute. I'm glad I've never seen her in person. It might get difficult for me. Fat Steven JFG says they forgot to seek out new life and new civilizations. That is true. Truth. Tom Jr. Jackson says turning 57 is throwing people off. Oh, now I'm like, why do people think it's my birthday? No, Star Trek is turning 57. You're absolutely right. That's right. Superhero Displays says, I feel guilty. Oh, man, you know what? I wasn't even thinking about that. Gosh, you guys, I'm flattered that you would want to thank me. I didn't even realize that. But okay. Superhero Displays says, happy birthday on this Star Trek themed occasion. I wondered if you could answer me a question. At what point does someone become a certified, bona fide, true Trekkie? I'm asking because I've recently ventured upon a voyage of classic Trek. And I wanted to see what all the fuss was about, and I decided I'm only watching the first few episodes and then turned into series 1, 2, 3, and now I'm about to embark on the animated show. Oh, and then I turned into series 1, 2, and 3, and I'm about to embark on the animated show, so can I now attend the cons? Am I allowed to say live long and prosper? Hey, listen, man, I've been accused of being a gatekeeper long enough. Many people have accused me. A Star Trek fan, a Trekkie, is anybody who has decided to call themselves a Star Trek fan or a Trekkie. It is not up to other people to put that title, to bequeath you. I did not call myself the Duke of Dope Discourse. Those were titles that were bequeathed on me. But you, my friend, if you want to call yourself a Trekkie, that's for you to decide, and no one else can tell you can or can't be a Trekkie or a Trekker. Call it what you want. I would say that anybody who enjoys Star Trek, especially the original series, is in fact a Trekkie. Okay, now we're going to get into Kirk Drift. This essay, maybe more than any essay I've ever read. Now, it deals specifically with Kirk. But if you apply this to Star Trek, the franchise as a whole, I would say that everything in this article, it doesn't just apply to Kirk, it applies to the entire idea of what Star Trek is. And I don't think, I'll say it right away. The people that are making Star Trek, I've said it before, are outside of Star Trek. They're looking back at things and they can't take them seriously. And I understand, because the distance of 57 years or 56 or 55 years is too much. They're not able to look into Star Trek and ever take it seriously, especially people, and this is not a slight on people that are younger than me. I'm just saying, as an example, if you've grown up in a world where Jurassic Park, the movie, already exists, and you have photorealistic dinosaurs, you have beautifully rendered, when that brachiosaur takes its first bite off that tree in Jurassic Park and Sam Neill's like this. We were that way too when the movie opened. If you were born into that universe, and a lot of people were because that movie came out 30 years ago, well then, it's going to be very difficult to go back and watch a stop-motion dinosaur as animated by Ray Harryhausen like in the 50s. As a matter of fact, I would dare say it's almost impossible, if you grew up in a Jurassic Park world, to look at that and take it seriously. You have to train yourself. It's not something that the average audience member can do. And I think that this is the problem with Star Trek, is that people go back because it's 57 years old. And I guess to a certain extent, the same thing is true of Doctor Who. But what you have to do is I honestly believe that this is the case. The people that are working on Star Trek now are doing one of two things. They're either trying to embrace what they think. It's a superficial understanding on two different separate tracks. One is that they look at Star Trek as something that they know intellectually that, well, back in the 60s, this show was progressive, and this show had things to say that they couldn't say on network television. It had the first interracial kiss. I know, that'll be debunked by somebody. I know there's many different instances, but let's just in popular culture, the first dramatic show that had, I mean, people call it what it was. It was the first time it happened in space, okay? But Star Trek was groundbreaking in many different ways. So you get like Star Trek Discovery, which embraces the groundbreaking nature of how certain groups are portrayed, and it leans into that. Unfortunately, it tells bad stories and gives us bad science fiction with bad science. And it's trying to skate by on a paradigm and an idea of representation, which is admirable, but it doesn't lead to good Star Trek or good storytelling. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But it gives you a certain highbrow sheen, maybe, that you can look at it and go, look what they're trying to do. Or you get the Lower Decks farce satire where all the cool kids, and I call them the drama clubbers, because they all act and write and talk. Every time I watch Star Trek Lower Decks, I feel this is the high school drama department, and they have their little clique, and they know everything about theater, and the outsiders don't know anything, and they're going to show you how much they know through every fucking thing that comes out of their mouth. The problem is, about 5 minutes in, you want to punch them all in the face, because you know all that stuff as Star Trek fans. It's like, you're not telling me anything I don't know. It would be really interesting, I think, if Lower Decks actually was it could be a comedic animated show that delved into what it would have been really like to be on a starship. Not constantly tell me that you've seen other episodes of Star Trek. The characters on that show have all watched every episode of Star Trek. It drives me fucking crazy, and I want to punch all the animated characters, but I can't because they're not real. But that makes me want to punch all the writers and be like, okay, you guys are drama clubbers in high school. You're all sitting around going, yeah, you know what? I know. How many times are you going to show me that, look at how much we know about Star Trek? For fuck's sake, what would be more impressive is if you could write an actual show, a comedic show, a workplace show set in the Star Trek universe that would delve into what would it mean to work on a starship, a Starfleet ship. What would that be like? But and the stories they've come up with, some of them are actually quite good, but they're all hampered by the fact that they're outside of the stories they're telling. It's a farce and it's a satire, and they want to show, it's like, we're the drama clubbers. This is how much we know about Star Trek. We know so much more about Star Trek than you do. I'm like, Jesus fucking Christ. You know what that's like for me? It's like watching Lower Decks is like somebody sitting right next to my head. It's fucking Quint from Jaws, but it's for the entire duration of the show. He's running his fingernails down that chalkboard in that room. You know, y'all know me. Know what I do for a living. Yeah, you're right, Star Trek, where you reference every fucking Star Trek episode that I've watched 100 million times, and I'm supposed to think you're clever. You're not. Half your writing staff's fucking reading Memory Alpha. Good for you guys. I'm like, you haven't surprised me once, you haven't told me one story. And the stories that I actually have liked, that you have been sucked into, they're just one big fucking loud cacophony of annoying bullshit Star Trek references. I'm like, stop it. Stop it, guys, stop. Take away your Star Trek references. Write me a funny animated story in the Star Trek universe where you don't ever reference other Star Trek stories. Make new Star Trek stories. I don't think anybody working on Star Trek can write an original Star Trek story because they don't know how. It's all variations on a theme. And if it's not variations on a theme, it's variations on someone else's themes. Like, okay, we're gonna turn the Gorn into aliens, xenomorphs from England. Yeah, we'll go that way. Or they'll be like, let's do a heady science fiction story. I know. Let's adapt an Ursula K. Le Guin story without giving her attribution or credit. Or let's go back and rip off Dorothy Fontana's. They don't know how to write a Star Trek story, which is sad, because if you go back and you look at something like Game of Thrones, there's 8 seasons of Game of Thrones, but then when you go to House of the Dragon, it's new and fresh, even though it's set in Westeros, different kind of a story. Because you had, George R.R. Martin as one of the creators of the show. Or a really great example, I think, is Battlestar Galactica. You took the premise of these robots that were created to be in servitude to mankind, They rise up, they evolve, they become better than they were, than mankind created them, and they come back and they destroy their creators. And so they took the basic premise of that, and they took a lot of the iconography, the Battlestar Galactica itself, the Cylons, and they plussed it, and they made it very modern. And they thought to themselves, okay, this show was never, let's face it was never great to begin with, but we're going to take because the premise was sound. But even the original Battlestar Galactica in the pilot episode, humanity is destroyed, and by the end, Starbuck's like, we can put these 3 girls up on the circuit. Like, what circuit's that, Starbuck? All of mankind's been destroyed, and you're thinking about gambling and putting those girls out to make some money. So the original Battlestar Galactica was no great shakes. So, anyway, I'm going to get to this article, and this is, in fact, a long, long article. And this is about Kirk drift. And I would say, to a larger extent, it's about Star Trek drift. And I would say that everybody who's worked on modern Star Trek since 2009, I mean, there's one exception. Kirsten Beyer is an exception because she's written Star Trek novels. And I would also say that Terry Matalas and his writing team with Star Trek Picard Season 3 definitely brought us back onto the right track. The problem is that Picard Season 3 is irrevocably connected to Picard Seasons 1 and 2, which there was no way around that. Terry was hamstrung. There's nothing he could have done about that. So it's still saddled with the baggage of 2 seasons of what I would say to be, call it Murder Trek, call it what you want, call it Patrick Stewart's vanity project. I don't care. But it's saddled with that. So Star Trek Picard Season 3 has to deal with what it was given. So since Star Trek has been made since 2017, Picard Season 3 is anomalous. I would say it's anomalous. So maybe it exists outside, but I'll let you guys decide. Kirk Drift. The name of this article is Freshly Remembered Kirk Drift, and it was written by Erin Horokova. And it is from the strangehorizons.com website, and it is dated April 10th, 2017. And as I said, this is a long article. I'm going to opine as we go through it. We'll see where we go. And I will not give you the table of contents, but here you go. What a lousy party. Good parties diverge wildly. All bad parties are bad in the same way. I'm trapped at a dull dinner following a dull talk, part of a series of dinners and talks that grad students organize unpaid, though at considerable expense to themselves, experience, exposure, to provide free content for the dull grad program. I will soon leave. The Thai food is good. The man sitting across from me and a little down the way, a bellicose boar of a vague continental origin, is execrable. He is somehow attached to a mild woman who is actually supposed to be here, a shy, seemingly blameless new grad student who perpetually smiles apologetically on his behalf in an attempt to excuse whatever he's just said. One immediately understands that she spends half her life with that worry in her eyes, that joker set to her mouth, and that general air of begging your pardon for offenses she hadn't even had the pleasure of committing. There's always such a woman at bad parties. She has always either found herself entrapped by a clone of this man, or soon will. We reach the point of no return when the omni-jerk, really I suspect there's one vast eldritch horror sitting in another dimension that extrudes its 1,000 tentacles into our own, and each one of this guy is merely an insignificant manifestation of the beast. They couldn't all be so boring in precisely the same way by chance, surely. Decides to voice some dinner party opinions on the original series, Star Trek. God knows why. It's not 5 seconds before he's on Kirk and the Green Woman, and he's mocking the retro-sexist trope, but smiling a little weirdly while doing it. His own insufficiently private enjoyment is peeking out, like a semi-erection on his face, a sort of Mad Men effect saying, "Isn't it awful?" and going on for the low-hanging critical fruit while simultaneously rolling around in that aesthetic and the idea of masculinity. Camp, but no homo. You're thinking of Pike, I say, the captain in the unaired pilot. Some of that footage got reused for a later story which made Pike into a previous captain of the Enterprise, and it never actually happened. It was a hallucination sequence designed by aliens who didn't know what they were doing in order to tempt Pike, and he rejected it. Bah humbug, makes some attempt to hedge, but when I stick to the story and won't give him a right anyway ribbon, he gets annoyed. He goes for a predictable mocking, "Gosh, I see you really know a lot about this," as if he hadn't been the one holding forth a moment ago. It would be embarrassing for anyone, I suppose, to possess specific information about a throwaway piece of cheap television. Not to talk about this subject, after all, he felt very comfortable bringing it up himself, but to know what you're talking about, to hold to facts. One may condescend to be amused by such things in an ironic way, and to declaim authoritatively on them, but not to actually pay attention to them. I ought to have agreed and let him be right. There is an argument to be made that that's just how conversations go. How often, though, is such harmony established by the concessions of women? And should conversations held on those terms go at all? The thing is, he isn't right. I do care about the subject, actually, and the strain in his girlfriend's expression, coupled with the complete lack of tension in his own, suggests he's been indulged thus more than is good for him or for the rest of us. I love that story because that's the entire writing staff of Star Trek. That has been since 2009, and it has been repeated over and over and over and over and over and over again because they don't watch Star Trek. And if they do, they haven't watched enough of Star Trek. And tell me you haven't watched Star Trek by telling me you haven't watched Star Trek. Most of Star Trek since 2017 is exactly the guy at the party opining about Kirk and the Green Girl. Nope, no cigar. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about. This is the pop culture sense memory. This is the Mandela effect of culture on Star Trek. And it drives me fucking crazy. And the people that have been writing Star Trek since 2009 are all these people. Except, of course, Terry Matalas and his writing staff and Kirsten Beyer. His was a common enough error, and he can claim neither the credit nor the blame for the invention. The pop culture idea of Kirk, captain of the Enterprise for the first Star Trek series, Star Trek the original series, TOS, and the original run of films has become almost synonymous with Zap Brannigan from Futurama. To quote Wikipedia, though famed for his bravery and strategic genius, it soon becomes very apparent that Brannigan is sexist, vain, and often very cowardly and inept. Brannigan is also completely indifferent to military casualties. He's arrogant, completely incompetent, chauvinistic, and stupid. Brannigan is supposed to be part comic exaggeration of the real Kirk, part reflective takedown of the source character, per wiki in some ways the ultimate aggregator of the vox populi. Quote, Kirk has been noted for his sexual exploits with gorgeous females of every size, shape, and type. He's been called promiscuous and labeled a womanizer. Note all of those still working footnotes for a fan publication in major papers and entertainment news sites. The article, Captain Kirk's 8 Most Impressive Love Conquests, gives such bon mots as these. For 3 glorious seasons, Star Trek's Captain James Kirk boldly seduced and explored women no Earthman had been with before. Well, okay, some of them were from Earth, but Starfleet's greatest discovery was that no woman anywhere in the cosmos could resist the intense gaze and off-exposed tan pecs of the Enterprise's head honcho. Who can blame them, really? Of the many, many seductions committed by Captain James T. Kirk, here are the most 8 impressive, not most exotic, which would totally include the green-arriving slave girl, but this doesn't, because Kirk had no problems getting her under Orion's belt, which deserved to be recorded in the captain's log for all eternity. The extent to which critical people believe that Kirk proper was at least brash is evident in Strange Horizons' own Nimoy and Spock reflections and farewells. I cite this example not to drag anyone, but rather to point out the pervasiveness of this conception among people whose critical faculties and interests in the text I take more seriously than I do those of The Worst Boyfriend. Serious, logical, balanced, Spock was the perfect counterpoint to the rash, bold Captain Kirk. Whatever, that's The Worst Boyfriend was apparently the person who wrote the article Nimoy and Spock, Reflections and Farewells, that also is on this website, Strange Horizons, which I have not read. And this is back to the author. Whatever gave you the idea that Kirk was rash? There is no other way to put this. Essentially, everything about popular consciousness Kirk is bullshit. Kirk, as received through mass culture memory and reflected in its productive imaginary and subsequent franchise output, including the reboot movies, oh, God bless you, has little or no basis in Shatner's performance and the television show as aired. Macho brash Kirk is a mass hallucination. I'm going to walk through this because it's important for Star Trek the Original Series reception, but more importantly, because I believe people often watch the text or even watch it afresh and cannot see what they are watching through the haze of bullshit that is the received idea of what they're seeing. Fucking man! That's exactly what has happened to Star Trek, to everybody involved with Star Trek, everybody making Star Trek, with the exception of a very few people, and that is the fucking god-awful bullshit they have been serving up to us since 2017, actually since 2009. And it drives me fucking crazy, and I can't stand it. Anyway, you know Star Trek before you ever see Star Trek. A naive encounter with such a culturally cathected text is almost impossible. And even if you manage it, you probably also have strong ideas about that period in history, that era of sci-fi, that style of television, etc., to contend with. The text is already interpolated by forces which would derange a genuine reading, dragging such an effort into an ideological cul-de-sac which neither the text itself nor the viewer necessarily have any vested interest in. These forces work on the memory, extracting unpaid labor without consent. They interpose themselves between the viewer and the material, and they hardly stop at Star Trek. I'm not talking basic Marxist conceptions of ideology here. By that, I mean the contention that texts have subtextual, unquestioned allegiances to various forms of establishment power, and that by what they choose to focus on, and what they choose to ignore, and what they thus render neutral and normal, texts convey propaganda for those hierarchical power structures to their audiences. Hierarchical? Very Jordan Peterson. I'm thinking instead of a related or subsidiary but distinct, vast, collective, motivated process of misremembering, which I'm going to refer to as Kirk drift in honor of this signal victim. Now, I would hope you can see, I mean, I didn't do such a great job of reading that part, but I would hope that you would see why I think that this article is fucking bang on. Because Star Trek is 57 years old. And the people that go back, if you try and go back and watch, if you're a post-Jurassic Park person, and you try and go back and watch Star Trek, the original series, it is next to impossible to watch it and understand why Star Trek became Star Trek, why it inspired groups of people, why was a space shuttle named after the Enterprise, why did so many people go in to become engineers and scientists, what did Star Trek have in the late 60s that nothing else had. It's very, 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 very difficult for anybody, much less a writer who's only worked on non-science fiction shows of today, to go back and watch Star Trek, who's never watched Star Trek before, and get it. I would say that the two people that you should look at that really do get it, one was, of course, that wasn't a fan. Somebody that went in cold was director Nicholas Meyer, a novelist. He'd written The 7% Solution, and he'd adapted his own book for a screenplay. He directed time after time. He came from a very artistic family. He'd never seen Star Trek. When he was tapped to direct Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, he delved into Star Trek. He was a very smart, well-educated man. He understood what was going on. The second person, we can't see what they're delving into the series would have given us because it was never made. But the second person I would say was Eric Jedrinson. Eric Jedrinson co-wrote Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning with Chris McQuarrie, that I think is still in theaters. Made over $500 million. Eric Jedrinson was tapped by Carey McCluggage and Donald DeLine after Star Trek Enterprise went off the air to create new Star Trek. What he tried to do was create a canonical continuation of Enterprise that led into the Romulan War, and he wrote a Star Trek script called Star Trek: The Beginning. He himself, I would ask all of you to go and listen to the Inglorious Trexperts episode that I guest on with Jedrinson as we talked to him about Star Trek: The Beginning. A script, by the way, I believe should get made. It needs another draft, but it is canonical right after Enterprise, and it has a very, very interesting take on what could have been the outbreak of the Romulan War. It should have gotten made. It was the first part of what he called the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He wanted to do a trilogy. It should get made. I don't know why Paramount doesn't make it. They own it. I'm not saying it's a perfect script. He only did one draft, and the reason it never got made was because the regime, Carey McCluggage and Donald Line, were out. Somebody who new came in, and then Bad Robot happened, and that's all she wrote, folks. But Star Trek: The Beginning could be the basis for a terrific script. And imagine, if you will, imagine this. Imagine this as an opening for a Star Trek feature film. Imagine the Paramount Mountain. Stars come up. Camera comes up, and as the Paramount logo has been wont to do occasionally, you go beyond the Paramount logo, and you're over in the sky. You come out of the clouds, and you're over San Francisco Bay. You see the Golden Gate Bridge. You see Starfleet Command. And the camera comes rushing down, and you see a group of hover catamarans, and they're sailing boats, and on these sailing boats is Starfleet Academy's graduating class. This is their final graduation celebration, the regatta, and you're seeing all of these new characters that we're being introduced to in the middle of a race that's in the middle of San Francisco Harbor. And you also get to see, observing this race, all the higher-ups at Starfleet that are watching this. Vulcan ambassadors, maybe Captain Archer, and they're watching, and you're hearing about these characters and who they are, and you're watching them, and you're intercutting, and that's the opening of this movie. You're literally at sea with these futuristic catamarans, and you're seeing our characters battling against one another. That's the opening fucking scene. Tell me that isn't an awesome way to open a Star Trek movie. You want to talk about Starfleet Academy? Make that fucking movie. That's what you should make. And then you know what? It's not going to be about, the relationships and what's going on. It's going to be action, adventure, allegorical science fiction. The best Star Trek. But nobody will do that because they didn't write it. But you know what? Hey, I would say that Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning, while it might be a disappointment at the box office, made more money than all three J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies, two written by Alex Kurtzman. So, I don't know. Maybe go with a writer that's written a movie that's more successful than all three of those. Just saying, just an aside. I don't know. Where was I? Oh, yeah. I wanted to come and see where we were all out here. So let me before I continue on, let me read a few more super chats because people have sent in super chats. Joe Panora says, at this point, Rob, you deserve 2 birthdays. Laugh out loud. Any update on the mess up on the Picard Season 3 Blu-ray? No. For those of you who might not have heard, there was a special effects shot that was mistakenly in the European release of Star Trek Picard Season 3 that they fixed, of the Enterprise D with a nebula behind it. They fixed it for our broadcast, but somehow the mistake was put onto the physical media. Typical. If you want another metaphoric example of what's wrong with the Star Trek franchise, there's another one for you. Roger, I haven't seen you in a while. Roger says, haha, so I have to jump on the bandwagon. Happy birthday. I remember spending the night at a friend's in 1996 watching the 30th anniversary show in my Next Generation uniform. Those were the days. Cheers, Rob. Would that mean you were watching Trials and Tribulations, because that was the 30th anniversary show. Sean Omumia. Everyone is complaining about the writers of modern entertainment, but yet defend the writers and their strike, and it makes no sense. Thing is, it's not all writers, and if you look, I've often said that the nominees for the Emmy for Best Comedy and Best Dramatic Show, that is some banging writing, man. We've got some of the best TV that's ever been made, ever. So, yeah. David Lightman says, Rob, love your work. Have you expounded on Star Trek Continues? If so, I missed it. Hope you've seen it. For me, an old school Star Trek fan, it was a worthy fourth season of TOS. Keep up the great work, my friend. So Star Trek Continues was a fan, I think it's 11 episodes, and some of it's quite good. Vic Mignogna played Captain Kirk, and some of it's quite good. Michelle Speck plays a new character that I really like, Michelle Speck. But when the writing was good, it was pretty good. I would definitely recommend watching it. Surak of Vulcan says, Trek writers don't feel widely read, just clever. Yeah, I don't think they're widely read at all. Doomed, huh? Says, I don't want to save Prodigy. I just want Legacy and Lower Decks. Okay, well, so there you go. That's Mike Swee says, so happy birthday. Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and thank you for the $20 super chat. It's Star Trek's birthday, not my birthday. Not my birthday. Yesterday was Star Trek Day. So, yeah, but I want to continue on with this article, because this article, again, this next part 2, is called You're a Womanizer, Baby. You're a Womanizer, Baby. Yeah. You're a Womanizer, Baby. Let's start, as people so often do, with the infamous green women. Yes, one existed in Star Trek, the original series, sort of. It was a vision on a planet Kirk wasn't even on. A captain was there. It wasn't Kirk. Captain Pike and this green Orion woman could literally never have done the deed. I should also mention here that the first and only actual Orion woman we see in the original series, Marta, an inmate of an asylum who attempts to seduce a suspicious wounded Kirk, who is himself interested in escaping dangerous captivity, she then immediately tries to murder him. Oh, l'amour, and then she actually gets blown up. Over the course of 3 seasons and 6 films, though I hesitate to mention the films in the same breath as the series, because even the initial run of films represents a significant reflexive reworking of the original material, we do meet some women Kirk has had romantic relations with. These previous relationships mostly seem of a type. Here are some of Kirk's past, the women in his life. Ruth, from Shore Leave, was a college girlfriend of Kirk's while he was at Starfleet Academy. The script implies she was also in Starfleet. We see only a facsimile of her. Dr. Janet Wallace from The Deadly Years was a biologist, and she and Kirk broke up in favor of their respective careers. Janice Lester from Turnabout Intruder was a Starfleet-trained scientist. Their relationship lasted at least a year and was strained and broken by Janice's violent resentment of Kirk's ability to benefit from institutional sexism. Check the tapes. I'm not exaggerating. That's what she says. Ariel Shaw from Court Martial was a dedicated JAG attorney. And Carol Marcus, The Wrath of Khan, retconned into history of Kirk's life by the films, was a brilliant, groundbreaking scientist. In one draft of the script, this character literally was the aforementioned Janet Wallace. At some point, I would also say that there's a few other, well, maybe she'll get into this later. At some point during his time at the Academy, Kirk almost married a blonde lab technician, where no one has gone before. It seems probable that she was one of the aforementioned women, all of whom but Lester were blonde, though dye exists, and all of whom but Shaw were scientists, though majors can change. I know an attorney with a biology degree myself. With the exception of Janice Lester, all Kirk's relationships that we're aware of seem to have ended amicably. He and the women involved have often kept up communication to some extent, despite the impediments caused by interstellar travel. Wallace and Marcus, the relationships all seem to have been some duration and characterized by fairly serious involvement on both parts. They were distinctly emotional affairs, and no one accuses Kirk of having womanized during them. They all involved competent people drawn to demanding, intellectually stimulating fields, usually science, and in the service of something greater than themselves, almost universally Starfleet. Kirk's storied history of womanizing seemingly consists of his having seriously dated a fairly small number of clever women in the universe, in uni. We're even told Kirk had to be manipulated into paying attention to matters of the heart and or loins during that period, and that Kirk's into long hair stuff like 17th century philosophy. Gary Mitchell says, "Well, I'm getting a chance to read some of that long hair stuff you like. Hey man, I remember you back at the academy, a stack of books with legs. The first thing I ever heard from upperclassmen was, watch out for Lieutenant Kirk. In his class, you either think or sink." Kirk says, "It wasn't that bad, was I? If I hadn't aimed that little blonde lab technician at you..." "You what? You planned that?" "Well, you wanted me to think, didn't you? I outlined her whole campaign for her. I almost married her. You better be good to me. I'm getting even better ideas here. You, Spinoza, where no man has gone before." That's the episode, the actual second pilot of Star Trek. Obviously, Kirk's clear serial monogamy habit doesn't preclude his indulging in wild shag fests with a side of chauvinism, because that's what we mean when we characterize neutral promiscuity as womanizing, is it not? But neither does his relationship history readily suggest that Kirk's a womanizer. In fact, I'd argue it would be less of a stretch to suggest that Kirk also had some boyfriends that fit this relationship description than it would be to suggest that he altered the whole well-established pattern of how he dated to moonlight as a Lothario, which, despite the fact that Star Trek the original series chooses to show no strongly convincing evidence of such behavior, we should somehow believe it happened because... Perhaps that strikes you as an uncomfortable or undersubstantiated jump. Real talk. The many and varied ways a heterosexist impulse separate from the show dominates its reception is friggin' weird if you think about it. Popular journalism and various fan-made resources that would scoff heartily at the Kirk Spock crowd are absolutely frothing to infer heterosexual relations and Don Juan characterizations based on evidence that is dubious at best. Sexual exploits, no woman can resist, explored them all. Jesus, smell the gagsome flashman colonialism coming off that one. Minging. Perhaps the most major difference between these interpretive camps is that the perpetrators of Womanizer Kirk see their self-insertion fantasy actively as absolutely neutral and unembarrassing, and their interpretation as the indisputable and monolithic truth of the text, whereas slashers, meaning those people that put Kirk and Spock together in a relationship, are made to feel their chagrin for even the most hesitant claims of queer possibility. They don't even go full Eve Sedgwick on this shit when they obviously could. No matter how textually supported an extra hetero interpretation is, it's illegitimate and crazy. Feel the gendered force of that hysteria accusation. Meanwhile, these male and female characters had eye contact, so they for sure fucked. I mean, he was a boy, she was a girl. Could I make it any more obvious? One perspective is thus rendered a claim, an argument, while the other, which makes Star Trek the original series into Don Giovanni and borders on a gleeful diagnosis of sex addiction, is just true. Culture conditions the legitimacy or illegitimacy of a given reading in ways that have a lot to do with the needs and prejudices of the moment, and only a limited amount to do with either the actual work done by the text or with its conditions of production. Look, for example, at the points made by Shakespeare in the Bush or Nina Arbach's work on figurations of the vampire. Even so, man-whore Kirk is such a meme. Surely there must be more evidence than eye contact in serial monogamy. As it turns out, it depends what you consider evidence. I draw from a chart. Question: how many total females did James T. Kirk have sex with? I suspect this document may be of Ferengi provenance. Females. TV show ones, 2 to 4 out of 4 confirmed ones were alien. Drusilla from Bread and Circuses, when Kirk said they threw him a few curves. Dila from Wink of an Eye. Elan of Troyes, maybe. Not 100% confirmed as a sexual partner, but very likely. And Miramani from the Paradise Syndrome, maybe. Strictly speaking, Miramani is not an alien. She was an Amorine who was a human offshoot living on an alien planet. Given its insistence on evaluating the actual material of the show and its efforts to distinguish between people Kirk possibly slept with and people he probably did, compared to many popular receptions, this chart represents a restrained and bearish perspective. Nevertheless, I find even this comparatively decent write-up disturbing. Its hesitance to differentiate between confirmed and implied is disquieting from an analytic perspective, but what's truly odd is how little attention it pays to consent. In Bread and Circuses, Kirk was a captive, and the sex is implied, not confirmed. This sex, if any, is also disconcerting and situational. I can't easily call it a cheerful example of Kirk getting some. Kirk thinks he's being watched. There's the suggestion the slave girl Drusilla might be punished for not satisfying him. I was concerned you might not like the food. I'm ordered to please you. By the way, one of the communicators we took from you is missing. Was it my pretty Drusilla by any chance? See if she has it. Not that I would have punished her. I would have blamed you. And that Kirk might have been trying to distract Drusilla to steal the communicator he needed to escape and save the ship and crew. Too late. Another character beat him to it. It's quick and deeply weird, and to be honest, this episode mostly sucks. I disagree. That's Bread and Circuses after a while. After all, that's a second season episode. There's even a big after-school special Christian message at the end. Uhura says, I'm afraid you have it all wrong, Mr. Spock, all of you. I've been monitoring some of your old-style radio waves. The Empire spokesman trying to ridicule their religion, but he couldn't. Don't you understand? It's not the sun up in the sky. It's the Son of God. Kirk says, Caesar and Christ. They had them both. And the word is spreading only now. And McCoy says, a philosophy of total love and brotherhood. I can't take anything that happens in Bread and Circuses terribly seriously. Some patterns of force level stupid up in here. I disagree. In Wink of an Eye, Kirk is again a captive attempting to manipulate his way out of a dire situation. In the land of Troyes, I really don't know that any sex occurred at all. And further, Kirk was drugged? That's the whole plot of the episode, that he was not only not actively pursuing a partner, he was also not in control of his faculties. Only extreme self-control and his sense of duty eventually enabled Kirk to overcome biochemical influence. In the Paradise Syndrome, Kirk has lost all memory of who he is, and he has taken up a new life as a villager, marrying according to their social customs. Again, this is not Kirk consciously making a choice and getting some play. It's a more coercive situation than even the next generation's The Inner Light, wherein Picard lives a whole life in a lost civilization in a moment due to the influence of an alien artifact. At least Picard still knew who he was in that instance. A Tumblr fan essay puts it well. Nearly every instance of James T. Kirk seducing an alien woman was not because he's some randy alien shagger extraordinaire, but because he needed to distract the enemy of the given episode in order to save the Enterprise. In the same way we wouldn't say a woman who uses her sexuality as a weapon, flirting with the villains to distract them and ultimately defeat them, is just some intergalactic bedhopper, neither is Kirk. What unnerves me is how effortlessly Kirk and the Green Woman conflates trying to get out of a situation with making a conquest. If your vision of masculinity cannot distinguish between choosing to have sex and situations of dubious consent incurred in the line of duty, it is deeply toxic. You are insisting that men are hypersexual, unemotional, and can never be taken advantage of, lest they cease to be strong, compelling men due to their ever having displayed vulnerability. You could say it's potentially a bit dodgy that Kirk uses his sexuality in this way, but that's the kind of dodgy we're looking at, and the distinction matters. I've seen Bloody Cat's Paw discussed as an episode where Kirk puts the moves on a lady and gets lucky. Here's some literal dialogue from Cat's Paw. Cat's Paw is basically Star Trek's Halloween episode, spoken just after Kirk tries to seduce a woman to get his crew out of danger. Sylvia: "You're using me. You hold me in your arms and there's no fire in your mind. You're trying to deceive me. It's here like words on a page. You are using me." Kirk says, "And why not?" "And why not? You've been using me and my crew." Kirk does have an occasional one-episode romance arc with a woman. Edith Keeler is the most notable entry in this category. There are a handful of such moments across 3 American-length seasons, which actually adds up to a significantly less romancing than most contemporary television characters on equivalent programs are expected to get up to. JD from Scrubs has more flings. This list doesn't even count the textural crushes. I hate this show, my girlfriend doesn't. Seriously board games I'm selling because I don't like them enough to see more play than Kirk. He's just too into his work. McCoy: "Spock, I've isolated the biochemical substance of the Elasian tears. It's a kind of infection, and I think I found an antidote." Spock: "You're too late, Doctor. The captain has found his own antidote." McCoy: "Are you out of your Vulcan mind? Do you know how long I've worked on—" Spock: "The antidote to a woman of Elos, Doctor, is a starship. The Enterprise infected the captain long before the Dolman did." Kirk: "Mr. Sulu, prepare to take us out of orbit." McCoy: "Well, I doubt seriously if there's any kind of an antidote for the Enterprise." Spock: "In this particular instance, Doctor, I agree with you." I am far, far from the only person to note that the actual Kirk falls short of our hot-to-trot image of him. Why am I bothering to make this argument again if womanizing Kirk has already been exposed by some nonsense? Because the facts have not yet displaced patently incorrect common knowledge, and because I think there are reasons why they haven't. These misreadings are supported by a subterranean network of ideas about masculinity, pop culture, and the past that consistently reinforces them, hitting refresh on these dank memes. I don't think all the connections have been made here and all the implications unfolded. I'm also trying to illustrate how different interpretations are held to very different standards of proof. Constructing an elaborate chauvinist narrative is normal and invisible as work, while other interpretive perspectives must, under ridicule, press against this received truth. Again and again, we see female-dominated media fandoms' interpretations dismissed as emotional and ideologically motivated. But what is all this vast effort to butch up Kirk but clear evidence of at least equally goal and emotion-driven work on the part of male-dominated sectors of fandom and popular reception? The amount of labor you have to put in to get from Cat's Paw, why am I saying Cat's Paw? Cat's Paw to Kirk Scored, and from Kirk the character to Kirk the womanizer, is considerable. What drives this casual or fanishly dedicated, unseeing but male emotional need to attack vulnerability, to uplift and venerate dominating strength, and to protect the desires onto texts, and from there, life? Male emotion is here, as in most spheres, parsed as neutral, rational, and just obvious. Its emotional content ceases to visibly exist because male desires are so naturalized as to seem the state of the world. The heterosexism goggles, which derange content via chauvinistic interpretive paradigms, become not just inaccurate, but horrifying when we look at episodes like The Gamesters of Triskelion. How would you read the scene in Gamesters where Kirk, terrified, with some reason, Uhura will be sexually assaulted and that he'll be able to do nothing to help her, seduces his own captor in an effort to protect Uhura and get his people out of the situation if Kirk were a woman? What about the surveillance, fear of death, and fear of getting an enslaved person punished due to his non-compliance in bread and circuses? Why are we cheerleading a vision of masculinity that cannot even acknowledge vulnerability and trauma in these cases, when, if this were a woman, we'd see these situations as coercive and violating? In Conscience of the King, we learn that Kirk is a survivor of a colony world genocide that occurred during his childhood. As an adult, Kirk attempts to determine whether an old man, now an actor, is actually Kodos, the mass murderer who perpetrated this genocide. Conscience of the King is a complex, shifting episode made in the wake of the arrest of aged Nazis in South America by Mossad agents. Again, it's subtextually important to this episode that Kirk is played by a Jewish actor. Kirk uses the actor's daughter, pulling her closer to him in the hopes of getting information he needs, weighing his desire for revenge against the responsibilities of his position and the imperatives of mercy. In turn, the young actress Lenore, obsessed with her father, uses Kirk to get close to and try and kill the remaining survivors, Kirk included. She aims to eliminate any witnesses who might place her father at the scene of the crime. At the end of the episode, McCoy suggests a romantic reading of the situation. "You really did care for her, didn't you?" Kirk smiles ruefully. Direction, acting, and by the way, Conscience of the King I think is a great episode. It wasn't a great Star Trek episode when I was a kid, but I grew to really like it, and as an adult, I think it's a great episode. Direction, acting, and writing all contribute to the televised text, which may represent many competing dramatic imperatives that have many valid interpretations. That said, McCoy's interpretation seemed to me patently ridiculous here, and his comment in keeping with other times McCoy has misread situations. The context in which Kirk cares for Lenore is a reflection of himself. She's lost to a destructive vengeance that also tempted him in another, more just form, mired in the events of her personal past and their shared trauma. They are both survivors, and yet they are also the tyrant's most afflicted victims. They live on with the pain, conflict, and self-recrimination. Lenore has tried too hard to sublimate these emotions, and the impossible burden of doing so has broken her. She didn't witness the genocide, but in some ways she's inherited complicity. Yeah, it's complicity. Complicity and guilt. She and Kirk are both struggling to put the past to bed and respond to it. Lenore, like her poetic namesake, is essentially dead. She has been since long before Kirk met her. There is nothing to love in her because she is only, through choices her father made after the massacre, possibly by his design, a living monument to her father's mistakes, consumed by madness and using people to fulfill a monomaniacal quest. Kirk isn't real to her. Her vision of the world cannot possibly admit his humanity, or that her father's other victims and would-be victims, or that of her father's other victims and would-be victims. Kirk, perhaps at times, fears this is true of him as well, that his self-destructive desire to devote his life to service is born of the antithesis of her motives, and that he too survives as Kodos' monument. So did Kirk care for Lenore Caridian, as McCoy suggested? He brutally exploited her weaknesses and used her, an appealing, charming older man pulling information out of a somewhat isolated, unstable young woman with profound daddy issues, even as she attempted to use and destroy him. She's now being cared for in a mental institution she'll never be released from. Sometimes the tail-end sting of injustice is that their aftermath involves their victims in complicity with evil, any way which they turn. Abigail Nussbaum has written about the trap genre fiction sets for survivors here, for the impure and unhealed who have any reason to be angry. In his attempt to put things right and avenge the dead and protect himself and his subordinate and fellow survivor, Lieutenant Riley, Kirk has destroyed both an old man and Lenore's fragile sanity and precarious life. He knows this. He's never been comfortable with either the ethical implications of what he's doing here or with those of inaction. McCoy's attempts to offer understanding and consolation must rub salt in the wound his keener self-knowledge has cut in him. This would-be flattering explanation puts pressure on Kirk's actual ugly, complicated, ambivalent feelings and actions. This is a pretty upfront, surface-level reading of the text that has the generosity to allow an obvious fucking Holocaust metaphor not be about dicking, that doesn't do the equivalent of assuming the Nazi officer Jewish servant girl love story in Schindler's List is authentically romantic and should be celebrated as such. Yet popular reception consistently makes McCoy's mistake, collapsing plots and emotional drives down into a pablum. But that's okay and normal because it's a straight pablum. Do you see the incredible violence this way of thinking about sexuality does to relationships and to stories that include them? The sheer stupidity of it? This conception of sexuality does incredible violence to heterosexual romance, compressing its rich and varied possibilities and significances down to the many, many seductions committed by James T. Kirk. Shall we lay the blame on the war? Heterosexuality has been through the fucking ringer in cultural productions in the last decade due to backlashes against feminism and queer visibility that have transformed portrayal and interpretations alike into dumb shows, crude pantomimes, as before the play. These frantic defenses have done more to render the proposition of men and women loving one another a piece of one-note, unsustainable ridiculousness than women's lib and LGBTQ rights ever could. So again, I mean, I don't know, but if you watch Conscience of the King and you watch that episode, would anybody today of a modern Star Trek episode write what she just wrote here? I don't know. I didn't even like this episode very much as a kid. I didn't understand that it was really a Holocaust allegory, and indeed it kind of is. I mean, I understood it growing up, and as a matter of fact, that's why the Reeve Stevens used the beginning of their book Collision Course that they wrote with William Shatner to show how Kirk was heroic during that situation where Kodos, the governor of Tarsus 4, executed half the population to save the other half. Now, I would say that, you know, this article goes on, and you can see it's obviously written from an academic master's degree level person who's writing this, but essentially the article, what it's saying is just how nuanced and how much depth classic Star Trek had to people who watched it growing up. And indeed, it was there. Nowadays, all people think about, well, Mike McMahon will make a funny episode of Lower Decks about the Mugatu. You know, and all of this other stuff, the stuff that mattered to me as a Star Trek fan growing up, is left by the wayside. And that's what pisses me off the most. I'm not getting episodes of Star Trek that somebody can write an article like this about, because everything is variations on a theme. The people that are writing Star Trek today do not know how to write Star Trek episodes. They just don't. They don't have the depth. They don't have the experience. They're not even trying. You know, they're writing a pulp sci-fi fantasy show that is at the most surface level. Their conception of Spock is ridiculously simplistic. And, you know, when we have other fantasy and sci-fi TV shows that are master's level or higher classes compared to the drivel that we're getting in modern Star Trek, it's really annoying. It's really frustrating. After 57 years, Star Trek, again, should be the Tiffany standard by which all science fiction, action, adventure, allegorical television are written. And yet we're getting the most dumbed down, like interpretations of what used to happen 57 years ago by people that are not qualified to write Star Trek. It's either farce and satire or both, or it's a ridiculously simplified version of what we got in the original series. And it pisses me off. And whether they're spending $175 million on Star Trek 09, which completely misunderstands the Kobayashi Maru from a movie that was made for $11 million, you know? And if you look at how much money that movie made in terms of how much you spent and what your return on investment was, what was the more successful film? Was Star Trek 09 more successful than Star Trek The Wrath of Khan? Now, if you took how much the movie cost to how much it returned, and that percentage speaks for itself. Anyway. So, I could go on, but I'm going to read a little bit more of this article. And remember, I want to say that the person that wrote this article, and I will put a link to it in the chat, is Erin Horakova, and it was written for Strange Horizons, and it's called Freshly Remembered Kirk Drift, and it was written April 10th, 2017. So let me go back and look and see what everyone's saying. Mike Waite says, first chat. Wasn't it great in the day when Star Trek used to inspire children to become better and inspire the next wave of astronauts? Does this even occur anymore? That's the question I have to ask. You know what? I don't necessarily, I can't speak to that because that I think we'll only know. Modern Star Trek has now only been around with us for 6 years in terms of the shows, the series. But maybe it does, but I don't know. To be honest, I couldn't tell you. I don't know, to be honest, and I ask this question, and I don't mean to be flippant, but what in modern Star Trek is inspiring? I mean, from a storytelling standpoint, maybe from an identity standpoint, maybe because people see a little bit of themselves in the character. I never saw myself in Star Trek. I only saw people I aspired to be. I don't understand this modern idea that we want to see ourselves reflected in popular entertainment. I find that bizarre. I mean, I watch and read stories because I want to meet people that I don't know, that I don't understand, that I'm not a big, I want to see things I don't know. So who knows? I don't know. Ron H. says, hey, Rob, did you get a chance to watch the One Piece live adaptation? As a fan of the anime, I thought it was great. You can always ditch the Trek train and jump on the One Piece bandwagon. No, but I did watch, before I went on this show, I did watch a Midnight's Edge video that Andre did, an editorial, that I thought was pretty good, that was comparing and contrasting the mistakes made with Cowboy Bebop with the successes made with One Piece, which to me is amazing. But I think he did a great job of breaking down just what the problem was. And again, it's really interesting because everyone here's what I find strange. And Andre brought this up, and I was thinking about this when I was watching this. People always talk about the fans. Here's the thing. And everyone's like, well, you don't. There's multiple lines of thinking in Hollywood about the fans. So people say that the fans don't matter because they're going to show up anyway. That might be true. Or the fans this, the fans that, the fans complain. But what I've always thought is strange about people talking about the fans is the real question people should ask is, why does this show have a fan base in the first place? What is it about this thing that created its own fan base? Why did people become fans of this? So the real question is not to look at fans and look down on them or attack the fans. What you have to understand is what engendered the fandom in the first place. What was it about this show? And when everybody says, well, we have to take this show and update it, I've never understood that, because that shows that you don't even understand why it has a fan base in the first place. When you say that you have to update it, why? What about this show do you have to update? I mean, with Star Trek, it's like, well, we have to give it a visual update. Why? Why do you have to give it a visual update? I mean, it's so strange to me that people are they're like, we're going to take this thing. Like, they don't give a visual update like J.J. Abrams didn't say, well, if we're going to do a new Star Wars, a series of Star Wars movies, we have to redesign the Millennium Falcon. They didn't do that. I mean, they gave it a rectangular dish, so everything if the Millennium Falcon has a rectangular dish, then J.J. Abrams gets a cut. Why does C-3PO have a red arm? Don't know, but it's J.J. Abrams. Everyone buys a red-armed C-3PO, I get a cut. Well, J.J. Abrams, I'd ask you, how many people did buy red-armed C-3POs? How many people wanted them? And did BB-8 actually wind up overall since their inception? Which sells more, R2-D2, BB-8? In the long run. I mean, I know you had to sideline old R2 under a tarp, but hey, did BB-8 ultimately sell more than R2 did? I don't know. But this weird thinking that you take these franchises that have fan bases and everyone's like, well, we have to make them appeal to people beyond the fan base. Well, okay, I get that. That's an interesting thing to say. But I think it's really important to understand why people were fans of something in the first place. It's not the fans you have to understand. It's the property. It's the IP itself that you have to understand. And when you start mucking about with the DNA of the IP, you better be fucking smart. Because if you're not smart, you're going to lose the fan base and you're going to lose that thing, that intangible thing that created fans in the first place. The only reason that there aren't more fans of whatever IP it is that you want to exploit is because the people out there in the world haven't seen the IP. Because if more people saw it, there would be more fans. Star Trek was a niche thing. Not everybody watched Star Trek. If everybody watched Star Trek, it would have a much bigger fan base. But what was really important, here's the funny thing. They thought that, hey, The way to expand a fan base is to take the thing that already has a fan base and change it and turn it into something it isn't in the hope that it's going to garner more fans. That kind of reasoning has never worked. It's completely stupid. It's the dominating thought in Hollywood. This is for a niche fan base, so we're going to change it. By changing it, you ruin what it was. You ruin the whole appeal of having an IP is because it has a fan base. So going in and changing its very essence, changing the DNA of whatever that thing is it defeats your purpose. It'll never work. And yet they do it all the time. Let's try and turn Star Trek more into Star Wars. How'd that work out for you? How much did Into Darkness cost? You tried to promote it around the world. Did Into Darkness, the most expensive Star Trek movie, did that make over $500 million on your almost $300 million spend? No. You took a bath in that fucking movie. You took more of a bath on Star Trek Beyond. Why? Because those movies are not Star Trek. Because if you were writing a Star Trek movie, you wouldn't need $175 million or $250 million or how much you took to market it. If you wanted to make a great Star Trek movie, you take the lesson of what happened with Star Trek the Motion Picture. Star Trek the Motion Picture famously cost $44 million. It was a success. But they're like, that's too expensive. I know. The development of Star Trek Planet of the Titans, the feature film under why am I drawing a blank on his name? He directed Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Wanderers, Philip Kaufman. So Philip Kaufman was directing Planet of the Titans. That didn't happen. Then the Star Trek Phase 2 TV series didn't happen. They turned it into Star Trek the Motion Picture because of Star Wars. But all that development costs that went down the drain were rolled into the cost of Star Trek the Motion Picture, which is why it had a $44 million budget. What did they do? They hired Harve Bennett from the TV division to make Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan for $11 million. Or whatever it was. The new book with about Star Trek II, the making of it, came out this week. Get it at Amazon. But the point is, you Star Trek already told you what to do. Go back and you make a much cheaper movie, and then you wind up with Wrath of Khan. In their thinking, they spent $175 million on Star Trek 09, and we're going to go do a shitty version of Wrath of Khan, but it's going to cost more money than Star Trek 09. What kind of clown car is happening over there? Who's running the show? People that don't know what they're doing, I'll tell you that. And because no one knows how to make good Star Trek. Now, to be fair, when I say that Terry Matalas made a great season of Star Trek, he worked on Berman Trek. He was a post-production a PA on Deep Space Nine. He worked on Voyager. He worked on Enterprise with Brandon Braga and Rick Berman. He came from that era of Star Trek, but he was saddled with Picard seasons 1 and 2, but then he went back to the basics, So he knew, but remember, he wasn't able to implement his entire vision because he was stuck with what they did with Picard seasons 1 and 2. He did the best he could. And I really liked Picard season 3, as you all know. Really enjoyed it, loved it. Clearly, easily, by far the best season of modern Star Trek because it had its DNA back in old Trek. Because the people writing new Trek do not know how to write Star Trek. They don't. Not really. So, because we have to change it, and we have to change this because it's not the fans will show up. We have to change it to make it appeal to a wider audience. No, all you have to do is promote it so a wider audience sees it. The more people that see it, the more people will become fans because they will recognize what was great in the first place. The reason that there aren't more fans to any IP, Star Wars is different because it's huge. The only reason that Star Trek didn't have more fans than it did is because not everyone watched Star Trek because it wasn't appealing to a lot of people. Science fiction fantasy, especially in the late 60s, even though we're moving into the space program, most people are like, that's not their thing. Even to this day, how many people watch science fiction, fantasy, and horror? I mean, there's a lot more than used to. So, but Star Trek is considered old. You got to win. You even have to win over. If you made a Game of Thrones level Star Trek show, and I don't mean with violence or sex, I mean with the level of sophistication that House of the Dragon has. I mean, if you make it a heady, frothy mix of Battlestar Galactica and whatever, you could come up with something that modern audiences would really embrace. Not the half-assed, horribly written, generic Star Trek we get today. Anyway. Nick Markins says, Rob, have you read X-Men Inferno and X of Swords since you really enjoyed the first part of Powers of 10 and House of X? No. Okay, so here's all I've read of Hickman's X-Men run. I have read I've read House of X and Powers of 10. I've read Hickman's first X-Men omnibus. I have read the Hellfire Gala. And then I've read the Hellfire Gala 2023. I am slowly collecting the hardcovers of the whole Hickman, the Krakoa era of X-Men. I'm getting the hardcovers because I only collect hardcover comic stuff anymore, and it's hard. X of Swords is sold out. Looking for Sins of Sinister's coming. I have coming Inferno, the hardcover of Inferno's coming. I have a big order of cheap graphic novels that I placed a couple weeks ago. I don't know why. Maybe I ordered something that hasn't come out yet. I don't think I have, but I'm getting the entire Krakoa era. I know some of it's better than others, but I'm thoroughly enjoying it, Nick, and it's dope. Stub McShave says, I got Patient Zero by Jonathan Mayberry. I heard it's good. Well, you'll have to report back, Stubble, and tell me what you think. Your opinion matters. And you should. By the way, I did reach out to Jonathan Mayberry, and hopefully I'm going to get him on the channel. So we'll see. Sean Omamiya. Is it Omamiya? I think it's Omamiya. Shout out to the chat, says Sean. Well, I'm glad the chat is doing well. Joanna says, Rob, do you have any good sci-fi book recommendations? Well, Joanna, these aren't going to come as any surprise to anyone who's listened to this channel, but I would say the Hyperion Cantos, at least Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. They were written as one book, but his publisher made him split it in half. Blind Sight by Peter Watts. I just recently read Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Read that. It's really good. If you want to read a banger of a time travel story, sort of, Replay by Ken Grimwood is great. There's so many, and then there's so many classic books to read. Fire Upon the Deep by Werner Vinge. Love that book. If you want to go, Earth Abides. That's another great book. Not The Dude Abides, but Earth Abides. That's a great book. And then, of course, a lot of the classic science fiction. Read Stranger in a Strange Land by Heinlein. Read Ray Bradbury, whether it's Something Wicked This Way Comes, Dandelion Wine, Martian Chronicles, The Illustrated Man. Anything by Bradbury is classic. It's great to read. There's an Arthur C. Clarke. He wrote 2001 and 2010 and 2061 and 3001. I read a book by him when I was a kid called Imperial Earth that I remember really liking. Or read some Asimov. Read By Jupiter or of course the Foundation trilogy, obviously. But I remember the Elijah Bailey robot novels. I liked those. Like By Jupiter was one of them. The Naked Sun, Asimov. But yeah. Just off the top of my head, that's something I would throw at you. So let's see. Let's get back to this. I mean, the thing about this article, that the reason I was reading, I'm sorry I didn't do a great job reading this article. I know it's a little dense. It's a little academic. But the reason that I really like this article is because Kirk drift is what's happened to classic Star Trek. People, even she says it. The author says it, that they can't even read, even when you watch classic Star Trek, you can't see beyond what your preconceived notions of it are. And Mike McMahon's Lower Decks does nothing to help. All the parodies, whether it's The Simpsons or whatever else, does nothing to help you. So it's really difficult to go back and watch any Star Trek and see what people saw in it. So, yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. So, and it's also frustrating because everyone's always asking me, well, Rob, about the original series, this, that, and the other thing. And here's another. I'd love to read this section. So I'm going to, because why not? It's my show. I can do whatever I want. This is part 4. Beyond the Broads, James' totally reckless Kirk and the very exciting Prairie Lights poetry readings he still attends when he goes back to Riverdale, Iowa to visit his mom. As a result of this toxic masculinity-driven revisionism, popular reception is as wrong about Kirk's general character as it is about his supposed hypersexuality. As Stefan Rabich has extensively documented in his essay, And Yet Everything We Do is Based on the English, sailing the mere incognitum of Star Trek's transatlantic double consciousness with Horatio Hornblower, which deals with both production documents and readings of the text, Kirk, like Picard, is based extensively on C.S. Forrester's British Age of Sail naval officer protagonist. The resemblance is not situational or superficial, but foundational, and carried through the series. Kirk, who is like Hornblower, an educated, intelligent man capable of great sympathy, also shares Hornblower's self-discipline, his commitment to his ship, his self-containment, and his analytical decision-making process. This is interesting because nobody would call Hornblower a lady killer, though he actually does have a few romantic liaisons and memorably brings Bush a pineapple. Nobody would call Hornblower rash. He is thoughtful, awkward, competent, etc. This is the man Kirk is based on. As with Blake's Seven, in many ways a critical British answer to Star Trek the original series that phrases its responses in the grammar of the original in order to better speak back to it, but mostly to sell itself, the right-hand man has in some ways stolen the protagonist's thunder. The narrative structure of the protagonism enables both Spock and Caravalon to do this, but it also doesn't hurt that both characters explicitly tell us they're clever with a special number. Spock has an A7 computer classification. Avon is the number 2 man with computers anywhere in the galaxy. The existence of Spock with his easily classifiable intelligence and over-egged rationality blinds people to Kirk's persistent, demonstrated, textually flagged extreme professionalism and competence. So, Portmaster Stone, this is from the episode Court Martial. Now look, Jim, not one man in a million can do what you and I have done. Command a starship. 100 decisions a day, hundreds of lives staked on you making every one of them right. Stone is not, that's who Percy Rodriguez plays. Stone is not simply discussing nerve, though Kirk has, via training and self-control, developed an extraordinary capacity for operating under pressure. He's referring also to the vast array of knowledge at Kirk's fingertips, to his ability to evaluate specialist counsel and make good decisions quickly in a crisis, and to his dedication to and concern for his ship and its people. Kirk is the only one, even over Spock, capable of resisting the influence of a deranging virus in order to protect the ship in the naked time. Rash, Kirk is obsessively protective, hesitant to destroy the Enterprise and its crew even when it would be safer for the galaxy for him to do so, and by any other name. This is, in fact, about the only time he's rash. He makes an objectively bad decision in order to protect the ship. It's not a lapse he often repeats, and he almost didn't allow sentiment to cloud his judgment on this occasion either. It works out in the end due to Kirk's cunning, not Spock's genius. As clever as Spock is, he's not the superior multitasking problem solver. That's the whole point of Kirk, and Spock respects him and his work. In The Ultimate Computer, when technological innovation threatens to replace living captains, Kirk included, Spock is immensely supportive of Kirk. He highlights Kirk's leadership, suggesting that he, Spock the computer expert, trusts Kirk's personal judgment more than that of even the most advanced machines. Kirk, machine over man, Spock? It was impressive. It might even be practical. Spock, practical, Captain? Perhaps, but not desirable. Computers make excellent and efficient servants, but I have no wish to serve under them. Captain, the starship also runs on loyalty to one man, and nothing can replace it or him. Wow, I got chills reading that. If Kirk takes a leap of faith in situations, it's because the other choice is to sit still and die. In fact, you could argue that it's Spock who sometimes behaves irrationally in TOS, prioritizing Kirk over the safety of the Enterprise as in the Tholian web, questing endlessly to find him in the Paradise Syndrome, and making a desperate last-ditch effort to signal the Enterprise with limited resources, rather than preserving those in order to marginally extend the lives of everyone on board a failing shuttlecraft in the Galileo 7. An episode I hate so much we'd need another damn essay. Kirk's decisions are often made under pressure, but they are also almost universally sound. Kirk is absolutely not a maverick. As a member of Starfleet, he obeys orders he thinks are deeply unreasonable and personally repellent, as in the Galileo 7. He kicks back only within the structure of Starfleet's normal push and pull regarding the implementation of orders. People who accuse Kirk of being unusually loose with the Prime Directive forget that the narrative suggests that the Federation is still working out a common law understanding of a concept that will solidify and become more important by the era of the next generation. That's the Watsonian explanation. The pleasingly co-creative Doyleist, one that his production series Bible was still working its way into being, and that memory of the Prime Directive would enter popular consciousness via TOS and feedback in a firm, fixed concept in the next generation. While I could give you endless examples of Kirk's restraint, his comments in Who Mourns for Adonias, when a godlike entity charms one of Kirk's female junior officers and threatens to keep the crew as captive worshippers, rather epitomizes the sheer distance between the reality of Kirk and the idea of danger-loving space sexist. Kirk, Lieutenant, all of our lives here and on the ship depend on you. Carolyn Palamas, no, not on me. On you, Lieutenant. Reject him and we have a chance to save ourselves. Accept him and you condemn all of us to slavery, nothing less than slavery. We might never get help this far out, or perhaps the thought of spending an eternity bending knee and tending sheep appeals to you. Oh, but you don't understand. He's kind and he wants the best for us and he's so lonely. What you ask would break his heart. How can I? Give me your hand. Your hand. Now feel that. Human flesh against flesh. We're the same. We share the same history, the same heritage, the same lives. We're tied together beyond any untying. Man or woman, it makes no difference. We're human. We couldn't escape from each other even if we wanted to. That's how you do it, Lieutenant. By remembering who and what you are. A bit of flesh and blood afloat in the universe without end. The only thing that's truly yours is the rest of humanity. That's where our duty lies. Do you understand me? Yes, I understand. He's calling me. Lieutenant, you have your orders and your duty. Caroline Palamas says, yes, sir, my orders and my duty. Kirk doesn't have much patience for neglecting responsibility in favor of romance, either in himself or others. Face it, Kirk is a big nerd who punches people sometimes, but also memorizes poetry and has nice chats with Spock's mom and loves the ship intensely. He's less tasked with enacting toxic masculinity in all its forms than many a contemporary male lead. He is a great protagonist, simply enjoyable to watch, effective and interesting in his setting, and more complex and lovely than he's given credit for. Kirk's as good a character as Spock, and that's how their dynamic and show work. I would swap any one of 30 contemporary white dude show leads for Kirk in a damn heartbeat. And I'm going to leave this article there because I'm going to let you all read it. I'm going to put this in the chat if you want. I think it's really worth reading. Again, this is a 6-year-old article. And one of the things that made me want to even bring this up, and I have to put this down first. Now I can pin it. Pin message. Is something else that I noticed for Star Trek Day, and a lot of people have noticed it as well. Here's the artwork for Star Trek Day, one of the pieces of artwork. Now, I understand they're promoting, Avery Brooks is here, even though Deep Space Nine isn't on the air, but of course they've been using Deep Space Nine on the various animated shows, and I get where that's coming from. You got Lieutenant Uhura, Nichelle Nichols. It was nice that she passed away. Pike is front and center, Picard, all of that. But you know who's absent from this? William Shatner's James T. Kirk. William Shatner's in his 90s. Arguably, William Shatner and Kirk, and to a certain extent Leonard Nimoy as well, the two of them are Star Trek. Now, I know that a lot of people, William Shatner might have pissed them off, but you know what? When you've done as much as he has in your life, when you live through as much as he has, he's earned your fucking respect. And your goddamn fucking franchise wouldn't be on any television shows if it weren't for him. And the fact that on your goddamn Star Trek Day, there was nary a mention of Kirk. And not only that, when you show him in a fucking animated episode, we get this. We get this. What is this? You recreate the Filmation animation, but you hire, another actor. Let's go. And I understand most people don't give a fuck. It doesn't really matter. But you know what? It says a lot. It says a lot about the people that are making Star Trek, and it says a lot about the state of Paramount. And your fucking stock price reflects what you think about William Shatner and what you think about Star Trek. And you know what? If the people that were running your fucking studio would have more foresight and understand that, hey, if you wanted to make Star Trek better and hire people that knew how to write it, it would be more successful. And perhaps it might bolster your price. But you don't. And you've given us drivel for 6 fucking years. And if you want to go back to Star Trek in 2009, ask yourself, has J.J. Abrams and Bad Robot, did they bring you the kind of money that you hoped from Star Trek 09, Star Trek Into Darkness, and Star Trek Beyond? Was there any return on that investment at all? I don't know. I mean, you have to tell me. I mean, hey, you know, Star Trek Day. Look at that. And lest we forget, at the end of the day, to show the serious nature of what you think about Star Trek. Now, I have no problem with drag as an art form or anything. But on your Star Trek Day, you would rather at the end of your show have her go around and ask people questions about what they know about Star Trek. You had a half-an-hour show that you put on. And this, at the end, was a comedic bit where she walked up and talked to strangers about what they knew of Star Trek from popular culture. Of all the things you can do, this is the problem with the franchise. If the people that own it and make it don't take it seriously, if they don't elevate it, and by the way, is this elevating the franchise? Really? You know, you wonder what's happened. No one takes Star Trek seriously anymore. Even the people that watch it laugh at it. You've turned it more into a comedic pop culture nostalgia trip. Star Trek needs to be relevant. It needs to be serious again. It needs to be thoughtful. It really has to have something to say about humanity's place in the universe. Where we're at now, the human race is on the precipice of many different things, and Star Trek used to be at the forefront of commenting on them. Not anymore. Star Trek, like so many of our franchises, only comments on itself. And what itself is to the people that make Star Trek is goofy. No one takes it seriously. No one knows how to take Star Trek seriously. Certainly not the people making it. It's all satire and farce to a certain extent. Or it's a superficial acknowledgement of, oh, well, Star Trek's always been progressive, you know, in a certain way. What is Star Trek Discovery? It's gone down one little thin track of what Star Trek is. Yes, it represents more than classic Star Trek perhaps did, but what it's not doing is telling great, compelling stories that were great science fiction stories or great allegorical stories or great action adventure stories. It has yet to, and it's the science in that show, even the understanding of the internal structure of what a starship looks like. I mean, Jesus Christ. Have you seen how turbolifts are portrayed in that show? Does anybody have a rudimentary understanding of what a starship is like? You know what's sad about that is I got fucking blueprints coming out my ears of whatever starship I want to get blueprints of. They're right over there. But apparently no one who wrote Discovery ever looked at them. Star Trek is the most well-documented TV show of all time. And it's like nobody ever pays any fucking attention. I don't understand it. Certainly, they're not doing their job in the writer's room over at Star Trek. And, well, no one's doing their job in any writer's room right now. But, I mean, I'm telling you, Star Trek deserves better. And yesterday was its 57th anniversary. There's a reason why we're still having Star Trek days 57 years later. The question is there going to be a 67th Star Trek day or a 77th Star Trek day? Will it even matter? I don't know. Star Trek needs to be better. It deserves to be better. And I hope it gets better. Because it's not cutting the mustard now. And it should. It should be the Tiffany standard, the gold standard of science fiction on TV. But it isn't. Because the people writing it don't know how to write it. They're writing other shows. They're writing the shows they're writing domestic dramas, and they're writing high school programs, and they're writing Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The Magicians, whatever the fuck they're writing. They're not writing Star Trek because they don't know how. Anyway, on that note, I think I'm going to end this show. But read the article. I think it's worth reading. I think it's a good one. I'm sorry, I wasn't one of my best at reading, but what can I do? Sean Amumia says, for the rant, happy birthday, Rob. Secular Monk, it is Star Trek's birthday. It's not my birthday. Mine's May 15th. Thank you for all the wonderful content. How would you solve the Kobayashi Maru? Well, I would probably do what Kirk did. I'd reprogram the test, reprogram the conditions of the test, and I'd make it possible to rescue the ship. Because as this article said, that's art. Or the other article said that's art. You know, the whole idea of the no-win scenario is that it was not what Spock said in Star Trek 09, because there's that scene, the Kobayashi Maru scene in Star Trek 09, shows just how misunderstood Star Trek is. Fat Loba says, because it's wreckable. That's a Gordon Gekko quote from Wall Street. I like that you said that. I love that movie. I missed that movie. But yeah, Joe Panora says, I saw AMC made an agreement with SAG-AFTRA to restart production on their projects. Could Paramount do the same to get Terry to work on his Star Trek project? How does that all work? Well, yeah, so the WGA and SAG they're striking against certain companies that are WGA and SAG signatories. So in order to employ the WGA writer or a SAG writer, your company has to say that, yes, we will sign, you become a signatory, meaning we're going to sign on to your what your union demands, what SAG demands are, what your basic contracts are. So if you agree to sign on and do work based on our contract, here's what we're planning to negotiate. If you agree with that and you agree to subscribe to that, then that's what they want the AMPTP to do, is sign off on that. So that's if they did that, they can. If AMC says we'll be able to make things, AMC meaning the network AMC, well, then they're not. If they agree, I suspect that we're going to see more and more of that, because the thing is, the difference is there's a really big difference. So Apple and Amazon, making movies and TV shows is not their primary business. Netflix's primary business is being a network, but their only income, I mean, they've been rolling out ad-based tiers now, but their primary business is subscriptions. And as I've said before, when they're producing a show, if they agree to abide by the rules, SAG and WGA rules and what they want, then they don't have a problem. But the real problem is they want Netflix. They want a performance-based bump, like with Suits. You know, Suits is doing so much business, or people are watching it. The problem is that Netflix has to pay to run Suits to the people that own Suits. So Netflix is not beholden. When Suits gets 1 billion views, they're not beholden to anybody because they're paying to run it. They don't know how much. They have no idea how much people are going to watch Suits. Suits it ran for 9 years. It has been off the air for 4. So when it's kind of like a syndication deal. And here's the thing. If somebody buys a show, it used to be if somebody bought a show like let's say the show House. You know, if you're in France or Germany or England or whatever, each country, the broadcaster in those countries would license House and have to pay money to the production company that made it. That production company, the people that own House, then distribute the money amongst the people that are owed it, whether it's writers, whether it's actors, producers, however they've signed up, whatever their contracts say, the Writers Guild minimum say, whatever, that's how they distribute money. But the people that are running the show in France, whatever their deal is, they have to abide by their deal, but they're not in charge of paying residuals. They have nothing to do with it. They've paid to license the show. So if Netflix pays to license Suits, they don't know that 1 billion hours are going to get racked up in viewership. They have no clue. Well, the writers now want to say, the WGA is like, well, if something is a breakout hit on Netflix, then we should get paid for it. Well, the thing is, why? Netflix, other than ad tiers, if people were subscribing to Netflix to watch Suits, I would say yes. But Suits has been on other networks before. So the thing is, not everything Netflix licenses out becomes successful. So the question is, how does Netflix have any money to distribute back to writers when they've already paid to run Suits to the people that own the show? The people that own the show are the only ones that are obligated to have to pay out any money. If Netflix runs Suits, they're not. They're not. They're already they're and this is what is crazy, and yet the difference is, so here's the big problem. Netflix, when they produce Stranger Things, they have to abide by SAG and Writers Guild rules and IATSE and whatever other unions they're using, which is a lot. So they have to abide by those rules when they make their shows. But the thing is, they're not making, once the shows are on, they don't know if they're going to be hits or not. How many Netflix shows weren't hits that you never really heard from again? They did one season, Goodnight Irene. Not Irene Jobson. And if you were with Irene Jobson, you probably would never say goodnight to her. But what I mean is, it's that's what I'm saying. And it's a problem. It's a problem across the board. So what do you do? I don't know. Let's see. Where was I? I don't even know where I am. Oh, man, I got to go. I have to go on another show. I am going on 6 Scale Mafia. I got to get off this show. I have to get off this show, but he probably knows. William Barr says, "You're 100% spot on, Rob. God bless you." Oh, you know what? I didn't answer Secular Monks. I guess I said I'd reprogram the test. I'm just looking to see if, I think I've got everybody. I think I've got everyone's super chats and super tips and all that. I really appreciate you supporting the channel. Roger says, I meant Star Trek 30 Years and Beyond. It's on YouTube. Oh, that's a show. I like that show. I remember that show. That's what you're talking about. Yeah, well, everyone, I want to say, first of all, thanks to Tom Jr. Jackson, and thanks to Lord Toth. I saw Lord Toth here earlier. Louise X. Sparrow is here. I want to say Louise X. Sparrow, she understands. She's a classic Star Trek fan. I think she will tell you the same thing I do. People today don't know how to write Star Trek, except some of the great Star Trek novelists do, which they just unfortunately rip off, but in a cursory way, which is sort of too bad. But anyway, I want to say goodbye to everybody. Come over to the 16 Mafia channel on YouTube. Like and subscribe to that channel. Hell, like and subscribe to this channel. And I pinned the article in if you want to read that article, because it's a great article. It's a long article, I know. I'm sure somebody's going to get pissed that I read it. But I want to thank everybody for supporting the channel, and thank you all very much. I very much appreciate it. I might be back tonight. I might do a Midnight Musings or a Midnight Metal. I don't know. And then join me and Dieter tomorrow for Let's Get Physical Media. By the way, Derek upgraded his membership to PGS Hero. Thank you. We're back with another member chat next week. I hope I don't get it cut off with power, but welcome. It'll be fun. It'll be great. So I will see you all later. And remember, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. And with that, I would say to all of you, have a better day. And James Tiberius Kirk forever. It's shameful. Shatner's in his 90s. At least give him a montage.